Nefarious is the latest film from Believe Entertainment. It comes to us from original source material from conservative talk show host Steve Deace. And if you did not know that going into this, you would think this is just a typical psychological thriller / horror film. But it's so much more than that. In fact, it's a Christian film in the genre of itself, because this is the only film that I've seen that's a Christian film that puts the bad guy at the center of the lens as being liberalism, Marxism, collectivism, and all of that. That's the true bad guy, but also who is truly behind all of that, which is where we are today with society. This film stars James Healy Jr., Jordan Belfi, and an Oscar-worthy performance from Sean Patrick Flannery, who stars as Nefarious, the lead character. And again, this film points all of the onus on the true bad guy of society and of the world, and it brings it through the lens of collectivism, Marxism, socialism, and the social constructs we see today of like not knowing what a woman is, for example. This film is incredible, and I can't wait to talk about it on my next Conservative Take. If you are unfamiliar with the way we do our movie reviews, then please check the link right here, and that will explain everything. Also be mindful there will be a spoiler section that we will note right here that if you don't want to know more about the film in detail, then skip over that by going to chapters below and going to Final Take. All right, for the story and depth of Nefarious, I'm going to give it an 8. And before we get into the actual review of this film, let's talk about what this film really truly is at its heart. This film is a Christian film, but it's of a genre that really I don't think has ever been attempted before. Typically, you have a Christian film where you have a protagonist and you have an element of controversy or a conflict of some sort that causes them to become a Christian or be converted, and then you have your whole story arch there. It becomes very predictable in that kind of way. This film is not predictable in that kind of way. There is an element of predictability, which I will talk about in my spoiler section, which is why I gave this actually an 8 versus a 9 in the story part. But the thing is, that's a little nitpicky, and you may think I'm being petty, but I think you'll get it when you see the spoiler section. However, this film is a psychological thriller, it's a horror film, and the ending is absolutely horrific. It's a hard R film, but I'm gonna tell you right now that I want everybody to go see this film, but I will tell you more about that in the spoiler section as to why I think it's still appropriate for most audiences, maybe, well, definitely not small kids, but particularly teenagers, okay, should see this film, even the ending of this film, because it is an incredible display of theological insight that most people will never ever see. I mean, if you're at Thanksgiving with your in-laws or your family, you talk about things, but you don't really talk about things at a level like this. But this puts it in front of you in a way that is subtle, and by the time you figure out what's happening, you're halfway through to the end of the movie and realize you just got a serious Bible lesson on theology in terms of Satanism and the impact, more importantly, on what's happening with society and how we no longer know what's good and what's evil. For the emotional impact for Nefarious, I'm going to give it a 7, probably because I'm pretty jaded, generally speaking, but I bump it up because the ending is such a hard thing to watch in some ways. I won't even really go there until the spoiler section, but take my word for it. It's got some impact, some serious punch in this film. Now, in terms of emotional impact, in terms of the film, in terms of suspense, he does a really good job. I mean, the directors who directed this film, do a very good job of adding suspense in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think, like him reaching over to shake your hand, the music, the rattling of the chains because he's handcuffed, how he uses that, how he pans the camera from left to right, behind the actual interviewer to kind of change perspective. Then you know what's going to happen when the camera passes this and goes to the other side of it. He does things like that, or I'm sorry, they do, the directors do this in a way that is really, really cool, because this film is a conversational film. It is a dialogue-driven film. It's not action sequences left and right. It's dialogue, and I will get to that in the intangible section of this review. So for the category of intangibles, I'm going to give Nefarious a 9, and the main reason is because of the acting, particularly behind the acting of Sean Patrick Flannery, which again is an Oscar-worthy performance. But what's cool about this particular performance is you have the interviewer, Dr. James Martin, played by Jordan Belfi, who is wondering, as well as the audience, is this guy a stone cold killer who is sane? Is this person insane? Or is this person something worse, a demon? But from people who know more about the production of this film, is it truly sort of all three? But it's a reflection of society. It's a reflection of the degradation of society and how we've gone to a point where we don't know the difference between right and wrong and how we got here. And it gives a theological lesson on the nature of Satan, his minions, and all of that in a way that you wouldn't know, because this is a Christian film disguised as something else, which is pretty brilliant. In terms of the intangibles, we could talk about the directing, we could talk about the sound effects, especially with the chains, because he's handcuffed to this table the whole time, and the rattling of the chains when he's reaching over the table to shake a hand, that is startling. He uses those elements for suspense there. He moves the camera from left to right. He'll take the camera behind the subject of the Dr. James Martin, and he'll come through and you'll see nothing because it's dark. And you come to the other side of the view, changing perspective, all of a sudden you're wondering, what is the other side going to look like? What is Nefarious going to look like? Because at some point in this movie, you see some supernatural type stuff happening, and you're wondering, is this guy really a demon or what's going on? It keeps you scratching your head, that is, all the way through this film, which I think is really good. It's challenging for a director to do that when you have a dialogue-driven film. There's no action sequences in this film. Well, there is a few, but it's mostly dialogue-driven, taking us back to days of like 12 Angry Men, and back in the days when you could just talk your way through a screenplay. And by the way, the screenplay, I would be remiss if I didn't mention how fantastic it is. It's based on source material from a book by Steve Deace, who is a Christian conservative talk show host on The Blaze, and this came out from that. And the screenplay is just so dense and deep. You need to listen to it, pay attention, because he's talking about elements in there of natures that we don't really know much about if we're not into theological topics regarding the Bible. So if you're a Christian looking at it, you see, okay, I get that. If you're unsaved, secular, just watching it for a film because you think it's going to be a psychological horror film, you get this. And it's a good combination for everybody other than small kids to see and in some ways enjoy, but also get something out of it and get a life lesson of what's actually happening in society, of how we've come so far so quickly in a downward nature. So for the category of watchability, this one's pretty easy. I'm going to give it a 10 because the screenplay is extremely dense. The source material must be amazing. I didn't read the book, but this film, again, is dialogue driven, but it goes pretty quickly. He talks about a lot of different things that you must watch multiple times. And for that reason, by definition, this film is highly watchable. And it's suspenseful, but there's so much more you can get out of this if you're coming at it from different angles or different perspectives. And so, yeah, this film is quite amazing. So for my overall score of this film, the score I gave on IMDb when I reviewed this film is going to be an 8 because of the reasons I mentioned before, and we'll talk more about that in my conservative take. All right, so now we've come to the conservative take spoiler section, and right off the bat, Marxism, collectivism, all that stuff is based and rooted in secular humanism, and that's demonic, period. That's pretty the premise to me. That's the wrapping it all up. This whole thing wraps up and points itself to Satan himself. And that's what society is. And this film talks to us about how we got to a place when we had morals and belief in God and all these principles to where we are now, where we don't even know what a woman is, where we have situations where something is blatantly evil right in our face. And we are saying, wow, you know what? We're actually getting better in society. And there's some dialogue in this film that is so powerful that's the reason why I give this film a 10 for watchability, because people are not going to get this anywhere, not even at Thanksgiving dinner, because arguments will happen and people will say, well, you're just coming to it from this perspective. Well, Steve Deace, when he wrote this book, he wanted to do a Christian film, which said, hey, you know what? This is not going to be a typical Christian film. This is going to be a film that's going to give incredibly intelligent and accurate theological principles based on the Bible in a way that people have probably never heard it outside of church. Now, I have some personal problems with some of the theology in this film, but it's minor. It goes into dispensationalism versus reform, but we won't go there. But I think all in all, it's very accurate. It's probably the most accurate film dealing with Satanism ever put on film outside of, let's say, a Christian film element. But yeah, this film really does a good job. In fact, there's some people that actually left the film at one point in it when I realized they knew what was happening, because they're like, oh, we can't stay here anymore because now we know what the directors were trying to say, so we're out of here. And so I know a lot of people are watching this film for the first time in the theater thinking that they're coming into it from a perspective of it's a horror film, psychological thriller, it's like, Silence of the Lambs type of deal, which it is. It's definitely a film like Silence of the Lambs in terms of that sort of element, but it's coming to it from a biblical framework and a biblical worldview, and it points the lens squarely at society, at secularism, at Marxism, at communism, at collectivism, and all of that. And it's really painful to watch, especially if you're on that side of the table. It reminds me a little bit of the film Joker, which does the exact same thing in a less theological, biblical way, but in a more secularized way. But still, it squares it on society, saying, yeah, we're getting worse, we're not getting better. So yeah, to that end, I think Steve Dace in his book and the people who wrote this film, made this film, produced this film, did an excellent job in that regard. The acting is top notch. Again, Sean Patrick Flanery is excellent. It's an Oscar-worthy performance. I, again, challenge you to find a better performance put on film. I think Jordan Belfort did a good job as well as the interviewer who was trying to figure this thing out. He played the character of the audience of figuring out what's going on. This is truly, in some ways, also a mystery as well. And there's a cliffhanger at the end of it. There could really be a series of these things as well, because we don't know where this is going. We don't know the status of Dr. James Martin, who is the interviewer. Also, I'll talk a little bit about the intense nature of the execution at the end of the film. We do see a person executed in a very brutal fashion. So it's not quite as bad as The Green Mile, because in that movie, we actually liked the character and we didn't want to see him, die. But in this film, this character is not very likable outside of the person who he may have possessed, which we don't know if he was a stone cold killer or was he possessed. We don't know. But at the end of the day, it's hard to watch in that regard. So I would say for young teenagers, 13, 14 maybe too intense there. But if you're 15 and up, I say this film needs to be watched for the reasons I mentioned as well. In the introduction of this video, I mentioned that I moved the score from a 9 to an 8 in the category of story for predictability reasons. And the reason is because the lead character of Nefarious makes a premonition as he's talking to James Martin, the interviewer he's talking to, that he would commit 3 murders before he leaves. And that to me was predictable because I'd already figured out number 2 and number 3. And I'll let you see for yourself, but I only knew this primarily because I understand where Steve Dace and the writers were coming from. But you may think it's petty because the average person going into this who's just watching a action suspense thriller would not actually take or understand going into it. So for my final score for Nefarious, I'm going to give it a 16.5, which translates to 3.5 stars and a go for my conservative take. This film is powerful, and again, it's just something that I think people just need to see. Just be mindful if you're a small child, say if you're 15, 14, somewhere in there, immature. I would say the last scene is probably too intense, but not so much that you shouldn't watch it. However, the dialogue in this film leading up to that point is the part that I'm referring to that people just need to see for the reasons, again, mentioned in this particular review. So what are your thoughts of this film? What do you think about Nefarious 2023? Do you plan on seeing it? Do you plan on recommending it to a friend if you have seen it? Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are. And until then, I'll see you guys in my next conservative take.